back to Ladies Can We Talk with Debbie Georgatos on 660 AM The Answer.
So good evening. Welcome back to Ladies Can We Talk. So glad you've tuned in tonight. As I mentioned earlier, we have a great guest joining us tonight, Congressman Jeb Hensarling. Hello, sir.
Debbie, thanks for having me this evening.
So glad you're on with us. I have to tell you, when I first heard about this Article 1 project, I knew instantly, because I'm a lawyer by background and because I love the Constitution, what you're probably talking about. But you are among the founders, along with Senator Mike Lee, of a project in Washington called the Article 1 Project. So I'll let you please tell our listeners what it's all about.
Well, many may recall a fairly famous saying from Madison, and that is, there are more examples of the loss of freedom through silent and gradual encroachment than by violent and sudden usurpations. And the challenge is, for decades, Article 1 of the Constitution, that dealing with the powers of Congress, has been eroded. Some of that has come from executive overreach. Some of that has come from judicial overreach. But frankly, a fair amount of it has come from congressional underreach, where Congress has voluntarily yielded its Article 1, Section 1 powers to an executive branch. And what this means, Debbie, is ultimately we are losing the foundational principles of the rule of law. We are losing the foundational principles of due process. We are losing the foundational principles of checks and balances. And so the Article 1 project is something that Mike Lee and I have put together with a number of other members to, number one, heighten the consciousness of our fellow members of Congress that for the sake of the Republic, we have got to reclaim our powers. We can't just be an advisory committee to the executive branch of government. And so part of this is to enlighten and sensitize our fellow members. Part of this is going to be about helping educate the public. Part of this is going to be a legislative agenda of how to go about reclaiming our Article 1 powers so that we can get back to government by we, the people, as opposed to they, the government.
I just love that concept. You know, in this era under President Obama, we're now in the 7th year of his presidency. I think there has been more attention paid to what Congress could be doing to impact things that President Obama does that perhaps the public, or at least the GOP voters, don't support. And so I think that there's a sense that this, the Congress needs to stand up and use the power of the purse. But you've described, and you're talking about this, that this is not concern about Congress not using all the power the Constitution gives it. It didn't just start happening under President Obama. It's actually a several decades long, slow, gradual surrendering of your authority.
Well, indeed, and it's something that both parties have been guilty of. The founders wanted to set out lawmaking as something that was time-consuming, laborious, and difficult. In other words, they wanted Congress to rule wisely and sparingly. And so what happens is, for the sake of efficiency in furthering policy objectives, parties in Congress, when their party was in the White House, yielded increasingly large sections of Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution that says all legislative powers are vested in Congress. They've been handing it over to the executive branch. And then the executive branch, in many respects, are handing out the power consequently and subsequently to the so-called independent agencies. And what happens is they become cop on the beat, prosecutor, judge, jury, and often recipient of the fine, all rolled into one. And we're losing again the rule of law to the arbitrary discretion of regulators. I mean, it's absolutely frightening. We see it in our loss of economic growth, but more importantly, it manifests itself in our loss of freedom.
I love that you went in this direction, because I really wanted to focus on that. In the United States, in Washington, we have all these federal agencies. One in particular that gets a lot of attention in the media is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And I think it's just remarkable how much our power has grown. And in some ways, when people in the public complain about, well, look at the EPA, Congress is kind of saying, well, we didn't really pass that law. We're not responsible for that. We can't do anything about it. So part of what you are going to accomplish, or at least a goal under Article 1, is to rein back in some of the federal agencies, right?
Well, indeed, and I'm glad you used that word rein, because there is a piece of legislation known as the REINS Act, and the purpose of it would be to force Congress to vote on any rule, which is just a name for lawmaking by the administration. But it would force Congress to proactively, affirmatively vote on any rule that had any kind of impact of any consequence on the economy, in this particular case set at $100 million or more. So, again, we wake up and we find out that it's not Congress that is governing over America's air quality. It's the EPA. It's not Congress governing over workplace safety. It's OSHA. It's not Congress holding forth over consumer protection laws. It's this Orwellian name, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau,
yes,
that can now functionally take away our credit cards, our home mortgages, and our auto loans. That has to change. In a free society, that has got to change.
Well, two things. Doesn't this go against the argument that many people in agencies would say was, well, the agencies and all their experts, they have the expertise, and you in Congress, you don't really have the ability or the depth of expertise to figure out how to regulate CO2 or what to do about consumer loans. Isn't that an argument the agency supporters would make?
Well, certainly it is, and I'm happy to have experts at agencies carry out the law. I'm happy to have experts at agencies make recommendations to the elected representatives of we the people. But ultimately, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution says all legislative powers, not some, not part, but all legislative powers, are to be vested in Congress. So the way this should work is not to empower the bureaucrats to be lawmakers. They need to be the advisory committee to Congress. Congress doesn't need to be the advisory committee to them. The whole thing has been stood on its head, and again, because of that, we're losing our freedoms, we're losing our prosperity. We have to completely change this to where, again, we reclaim our legislative powers, and certainly one of the ways to do that is through the power of the purse.
Yeah, I love that because your answer, I think, is just perfect. The fact that the agencies have the expertise, or they may claim they do, doesn't mean that they get to make the rules. It means they need to be advising Congress, here's what our information is. But ultimately, the idea that, especially because several of the agencies, I always go back to the EPA because they particularly bother me, but because they are able to be kind of judge and jury, it is really a violation of the notion of separation of powers, because they are essentially making regulations almost like laws, imposing the fine, collecting the fine, and that's really a mixture of, it's a violation of the separation of the legislative function from the executive function.
Well, you have certainly figured it out, and I'm sure the listeners will figure it out as well. That's what's going on. And just as an aside, if there's an agency of government that has killed off more jobs, hope, and economic growth than the EPA, I certainly do not know its name. So I have no doubt there are some good people at the EPA, but they should not be, under our Constitution, be allowed to be judge, jury, prosecutor, legislator, recipient of the fine, all rolled into one. Clean air, clean water, these are serious topics, serious subjects. But under our Constitution, it's the elected representatives of the people have to be held accountable. And last I looked, we're holding an election in November, and a lot of people will be held accountable. These bureaucrats are never held accountable. They're almost impossible to fire. We don't even know their names. Many of them operate in arbitrary, capricious, and harmful fashions. The law becomes whatever they decide to say it is, depending upon what side of the bed they woke up on that day. It is unfair, it is unjust, it is unconstitutional, and part of this Article 1 project is to change it.
Just love it. So, Congressman Hensarling, you mentioned the need to change the culture of Congress. It's really letting your fellow members of Congress know that we're kind of surrendering our constitutional authority and really letting the American people down if we don't reassert our role and our place. So how's it going talking to your fellow members of Congress about this?
Well, so far so good. We started out with a group of 10, a lot of interest in other members. I'm very happy to say that the Speaker, Paul Ryan of the House, has also decided to launch a similar effort within the House. What I'm doing with Mike Lee is obviously both Senate and House oriented, but at the highest levels of the elected Republican leadership in the House, they have realized as well that we have yielded these Article I powers too long to the detriment of the people, and that we're losing foundational principles. So I think we're off to a good start here, and over the next few weeks to months, expect to hear more from the project and expect to see actual legislation come forth and different ideas about not only changing laws but changing the culture of Congress as well. And listen, it's going to be more hard work for our elected representatives. It means we'll have to pore over a lot more matters, and we'll have to take some responsibility. But if you can't stand the heat, don't hang around in the kitchen.
Love that. Where can people learn more about this? Because I think it's just it's not an expansion of Congress's power. It's a reassertion of it. And it's a vital thing for our balance of power in Washington. So where can people learn more about this?
Well, on our Facebook page, which is /Article I Project, we would invite everyone to come and be a part and weigh in. I can assure you all wisdom does not come from Washington. Very little wisdom comes from Washington. And perspectives from we, the people, would be helpful, and just talk it up amongst our fellow citizens. It's a vitally important project, again, for our freedom and our prosperity.
Okay, we are speaking tonight with Congressman Jeb Hensarling, who is one of the two founders, along with Senator Mike Lee, of the Article I Project, the mission to reassert the constitutional role Congress is meant to play under Article I. And I applaud this effort. I hope we can have you on again in a few months and hear how this is going.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Thanks so much for calling in. This is Debbie Georgatos, and ladies, can we talk? Do not touch that radio.